My husband's family made me walk behind them at the funeral like a servant. Know your place, his mother hissed. Mourners stared in shock. I followed silently, clutching the envelope the deceased had given me. The will reading was going to be interesting. The hearse pulled away from the church parking lot, leaving behind a sea of black-clad mourners, and that's when Samantha struck. "You walk behind us," she hissed, her manicured fingers adjusting her designer hat with theatrical precision. "You're not real family." 23 years. 23 years of marriage to her son Justin, and this is how she chose to honor Andrew's memory, by putting me in my place at his own funeral. The words hit me like a physical blow, but what hurt more was the silence that followed. Justin stood there, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, staring at the ground as if the asphalt held the secrets to the universe. His brother Mark shuffled his feet, suddenly fascinated by his phone screen. Danielle, his sister, actually smirked, a cruel twist of her lips that she tried to hide behind her black lace handkerchief. "Did you hear me?" Samantha's voice cut through the November air like shattered glass. "Behind us. That's where you belong." Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories about finding your strength when others try to diminish you. If you believe that every woman deserves respect and dignity, regardless of her background or bank account, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need to know they're not alone in these struggles. Now let's see how Andrew's final gift changes everything. The funeral procession was forming, and families were lining up according to some invisible hierarchy that apparently placed me at the very bottom. I watched as cousins I'd hosted for Thanksgiving dinners positioned themselves ahead of me. Neighbors who barely knew Andrew's middle name took their places in front of the woman who'd spent the last 3 months bringing him homemade soup and listening to his stories about the Korean War. My purse felt heavy against my side, not from its contents, but from the weight of the envelope tucked carefully inside. Andrew had pressed it into my hands just 7 days ago, his fingers trembling from the medication but his eyes sharp and knowing. "Don't open this unless they betray you," he'd whispered, and somehow, even in his weakened state, he'd known this moment would come. "Nicole." Justin's voice was barely above a whisper. Just do what she says. Please. It's Dad's funeral." That's when something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked. Like ice on a lake in early spring, still holding but showing the fractures that would eventually split it wide open. He was asking me to submit, to accept humiliation, to dishonor his father's memory by dishonoring the woman Andrew had grown to love like a daughter. "Of course," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I understand perfectly." But I didn't move. Not yet. I stood there, letting the moment crystallize, letting every person within earshot witness what the Morrison family was really made of. Mrs. Henderson from our church, the same woman who'd praised my casserole at the potluck just last month, caught my eye and shook her head in disgust. Even strangers were staring now, their faces twisted with confusion and embarrassment on my behalf. The envelope seemed to pulse against my hip like a living thing. Andrew's final gift, his insurance policy against exactly this kind of cruelty. "Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait," he told me during one of our quiet conversations in his room, when the rest of the family was downstairs arguing about medical bills and inheritance taxes. "Patience isn't weakness, Nicole. It's preparation." Samantha tapped her foot impatiently, her funeral director's rehearsed sympathy mask slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. She'd planned this. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of grief-fueled poor judgment. This was deliberate, calculated humiliation designed to remind me of my place in the family pecking order. "The cars are waiting," Mark announced, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. He'd borrowed $15,000 from me last year to cover his gambling debts. Money I'd lent him without question because that's what family does. Apparently, family loyalty only flowed one direction in the Morrison household. I finally moved, taking my position behind them like some sort of domestic help following her employers to an event she wasn't really invited to attend. The whispers started immediately, a low buzz of confusion and disapproval that followed us toward the waiting cars. I could feel eyes on me, could sense the awkward discomfort of people trying to process what they were witnessing. "She's walked behind them before," I heard someone murmur and realized with a jolt that this pattern was visible to others. How many family photos had I been relegated to the back row? How many holiday gatherings had I been assigned to the kitchen while they held court in the living room? How many times had I accepted the role of servant in my own marriage? The funeral home's black Cadillac gleamed in the afternoon sun, its chrome bumper reflecting my face in fragments. I looked older than my 52 years, worn down by decades of small battles and quiet surrenders. My simple black dress, purchased from a department store, not a boutique, felt shabby next to Samantha's designer grief ensemble. Even my grief was apparently inadequate by Morrison family standards. As we reached the cars, Danielle turned back with false concern painted across her features. "Oh, Nicole, there might not be room in the family car. You understand, right? Close relatives only." The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual delivery. Close relatives only, at the funeral of the man who'd become more of a father to me than my own had ever been. The man who'd held my hand when I miscarried our second child, who'd driven 3 hours to my mother's funeral when Justin was too busy with work, who defended me when his family made their cutting remarks about my background. "I'll ride with the Hendersons," I said, my voice carrying farther than I'd intended. They offered earlier. Mrs. Henderson immediately stepped forward, her arm linking through mine with surprising strength. "Of course, dear. You're family to us." The word family hung in the air like an indictment. Real family doesn't make each other walk behind them. Real family doesn't abandon each other in moments of grief. Real family doesn't weaponize funerals to settle old scores. As the procession began to move, I found myself in the third car, watching the Morrison family through the rear window of their lead vehicle. They sat in their appointed positions, heads held high, playing their parts in some twisted theater where grief came second to power dynamics and love was rationed according to bloodlines and bank accounts. The envelope pressed against my side with each turn, each bump in the road. Andrew's voice echoed in my memory. "They'll show you who they really are, Nicole. And when they do, you'll know what to do." I was beginning to understand that walking behind them wasn't my humiliation. It was my liberation. From this position I could see everything they couldn't. The full scope of their cruelty, the complete picture of their dysfunction, the total absence of the values Andrew had tried so hard to instill in them. The cemetery gates came into view, and with them, the next phase of what Andrew had clearly anticipated would be my awakening. I wasn't walking behind them anymore. I was following them, straight into the trap he'd so carefully prepared. The family home felt different as we stepped through the front door. The same mahogany panels, the same crystal chandelier casting fractured light across the foyer, but something fundamental had shifted. Andrew's presence lingered in every corner. His reading glasses still folded on the side table, his favorite coffee mug unwashed in the kitchen sink, his slippers positioned perfectly beside his recliner as if he might return at any moment. "Everyone in the den," Samantha announced, her authoritative tone cutting through the post-funeral silence. She'd shed her grieving widow performance the moment we'd crossed the threshold, transforming back into the family matriarch who ruled through intimidation and emotional manipulation. The den had always been the seat of Morrison power. Dark leather furniture arranged in a perfect semicircle, Andrew's massive oak desk commanding the room like a throne. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Morrisons staring down with expressions of entitled superiority. I'd sat in this room exactly twice in 23 years, both times relegated to the uncomfortable wooden chair tucked in the corner like an afterthought. Today was no different. "Nicole, you can stand over there." Danielle gestured toward the wall with casual dismissal as if directing hired help to their station. The others settled into their assigned seats, Justin beside his mother on the main sofa, Mark in Andrew's favorite wingback chair, Danielle curled into the love seat she'd claimed as her own since childhood. I remained standing, my back against the bookshelf filled with Andrew's beloved first editions. The irony wasn't lost on me. Surrounded by stories of underdogs and unlikely heroes while being treated like an unwelcome guest in what had supposedly been my family home for over 2 decades. The lawyer arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, his nervous energy immediately filling the room. Harold Brennan had been the family attorney for 15 years, handling everything from business contracts to divorce proceedings for various Morrison relatives. He fumbled with his briefcase, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone, especially me. "Shall we begin?" His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat twice before opening the folder containing what they all believed was Andrew's last will and testament. Samantha leaned forward eagerly, her fingers drumming against the sofa arm in barely contained anticipation. Mark straightened his tie, already mentally calculating his windfall. Danielle practically bounced in her seat, her phone ready to photograph whatever beach house deed she expected to receive. "The last will and testament of Andrew Morrison," Harold began, his voice gaining strength as he fell into the familiar rhythm of legal language. "Being of sound mind and body, I hereby distribute my earthly possessions as follows." Each bequest landed like a perfectly aimed arrow. Mark would inherit 40% of Morrison Construction, along with the commercial properties downtown. Danielle received the beach house in Charleston, the same property where I'd helped plan 3 family reunions, painted the guest bedrooms myself, and planted the garden that had become her Instagram backdrop. Justin inherited the investment portfolio, the remaining 60% of the business and the family home. Me? Nothing. Not even a mention. 23 years of marriage, and Andrew had apparently forgotten I existed when dividing his life's work among his heirs. "That concludes the reading," Harold announced, snapping the folder shut with finality that echoed through the room like a judge's gavel. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before the celebration began. "Oh my goodness!" Danielle actually clapped her hands together, her grief forgotten in the rush of acquisition. "The beach house. I can finally renovate the kitchen the way I've always wanted." Mark was already pulling out his phone, probably calculating property values and rental income. Justin sat frozen, staring at his hands folded in his lap, but I caught the slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Samantha turned to me with theatrical sympathy. "I'm sure you understand, dear. Andrew wanted to keep everything in the family bloodline. You can live in the guest house if you need time to adjust." The guest house. A converted garage with 1 bedroom and a kitchenette that barely qualified as livable space. After 2 decades of hosting their holidays, managing their social calendars and caring for Andrew through his illness, they were offering me charity housing on property that was supposedly no longer mine. "That's what happens when you marry up," Danielle whispered to Mark, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Eventually reality catches up." Marry up. As if my state university education and teaching career made me fundamentally inferior to their inherited wealth and social connections. As if love could be measured in stock portfolios and property deeds. Harold was packing his briefcase with unusual haste, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics playing out before him. His hands shook slightly as he organized his papers, and he kept glancing toward the door as if planning his escape route. That's when I finally spoke. "That wasn't Andrew's will." My voice cut through their premature celebration like a blade through silk. "That was yours." The room went silent. Not the comfortable quiet of satisfied heirs, but the electric stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. For faces turned toward me with identical expressions of confusion and growing alarm. I reached into my purse and withdrew the envelope Andrew had pressed into my hands 7 days earlier. The paper felt warm against my fingers as if it had been absorbing my body heat, waiting for this exact moment. "Harold, I believe you need to read this first." My voice remained steady, controlled. 23 years of swallowing insults and accepting dismissal had taught me to mask my emotions perfectly. But inside, something was awakening, a fierce satisfaction that I'd never experienced before. Harold accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. His face went pale as he examined the exterior notarization, the official seals, the date stamp that was clearly more recent than the document he'd just finished reading. This appears to be another will," he stammered, his professional composure cracking completely. "Andrew's real will," I corrected gently. "The one he actually signed." "Read it." Justin found his voice first. "Nicole, what is this? Some kind of joke?" But Harold was already opening the envelope, his eyes scanning the contents rapidly. His face went from pale to ashen as he read, his hands now shaking visibly. This is highly irregular," he managed. "This document appears to be legitimate, and it's dated 3 weeks ago. It supersedes the previous will entirely." "Read it," Samantha demanded, her voice sharp with growing panic. Harold cleared his throat, his professional training warring with obvious personal discomfort. "The last will and testament of Andrew Morrison, dated." He paused, glancing at the fraudulent document still lying on the coffee table. "This is dated after the will I just read." The implications hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. "According to this document," Harold continued, his voice barely above a whisper, Andrew Morrison leaves his entire estate to his daughter-in-law, Nicole Morrison, with the following note. If this document is not read first, my family has committed fraud. Hold them accountable. The words hit the room like a physical force. Danielle gasped. Mark's phone clattered to the floor. Justin stared at me as if seeing me for the first time in our entire marriage. But it was Samantha's reaction that told me everything I needed to know. No shock. No confusion. Just cold, calculating fury, the expression of someone whose carefully laid plans had just been exposed. Andrew had known. He'd known exactly what they would try to do, and he'd prepared accordingly. The game had just begun. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Samantha's mouth opened and closed twice before she managed to form words, her usual commanding presence dissolving into something brittle and desperate. That's fake, she declared, but her voice lacked conviction. The woman who had terrorized family gatherings for decades now sounded like a child caught in an obvious lie. Andrew was. He was confused toward the end. The medication made him paranoid. But even as she spoke, I could see the cracks forming in her facade. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she reached for her water glass, and the calculated composure that had been her weapon for so long was crumbling in real time. So is your smile, I replied, reaching into my purse once more. The second envelope emerged slowly, deliberately. Inside was a small flash drive. Nothing dramatic, just a simple piece of technology that contained the power to destroy everything they thought they knew about their carefully constructed world. Mark shifted uncomfortably in Andrew's chair, his face cycling through confusion, fear, and something that looked almost like relief. Nicole, what are you doing? This is insane. Is it? I held the flash drive between my thumb and forefinger, letting the afternoon light catch its metallic surface. Andrew always said the truth has a way of revealing itself. He just needed to make sure it had the right platform. Danielle had stopped pacing and was now pressed against the far wall, her earlier excitement about the beach house completely forgotten. You're scaring me, she whispered, though whether she was addressing me or the situation in general wasn't clear. Harold's laptop sat open on the coffee table, its screen casting a blue glow across the darkening room. His hands shook as he accepted the flash drive, and I noticed sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature. I don't think this is appropriate, he stammered. Perhaps we should schedule another meeting when everyone has had time to process. Play it, I interrupted gently. Andrew specifically requested that if his original will wasn't honored, this recording should be viewed immediately. It's all part of his final wishes. The lawyer's face went through several color changes as he processed the implications. His career, his reputation, possibly his freedom. Everything hung in the balance of whatever was contained on that tiny device. Justin finally found his voice. Nicole, please. Whatever this is, we can work it out as a family. Dad wouldn't have wanted. Your father wanted exactly this, I said, my voice cutting through his desperate plea. He spent his final months documenting everything. Every conversation, every scheme, every casual cruelty you all thought went unnoticed. The flash drive clicked into the USB port with a sound that seemed to echo through the room like a judge's gavel. Harold's fingers hesitated over the touchpad, but the legal implications of refusing to follow a deceased client's explicit instructions ultimately overrode his personal discomfort. The video began with Andrew sitting in his favorite chair, the same wingback that Mark now occupied. But this version of Andrew looked different from the frail man who had passed away just days earlier. His eyes were sharp, focused, filled with purpose and a strange kind of peace. If you're seeing this, Andrew's voice filled the room with startling clarity, they've already tried to erase Nicole. They're also responsible for more than just forgery. The words hit like physical blows. Samantha's water glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. The sound made everyone jump except me. I'd been prepared for this moment since Andrew first showed me the recording 3 weeks ago. More than just forgery? Justin's voice cracked like a teenager's. What does that mean? But Andrew wasn't finished. The camera angle shifted and suddenly we were watching a different scene entirely. Hidden camera footage from this very room, timestamped 2 weeks before Andrew's death. The quality was grainy but the audio was crystal clear. Samantha's voice, low and conspiratorial. The doctor said his bones are brittle now. One fall down those stairs. Mark's response was immediate. Mom, we can't talk about this here. He never uses the handrail anymore, Samantha continued, ignoring her son's warning. All those medications make him dizzy. Accidents happen all the time to elderly people. Harold appeared in the frame, his nervous energy even more pronounced in the recording. We need to be very careful about timing. If the will changes are too recent, it could raise questions. Then we make sure there aren't any questions, Mark said, his voice cold in a way I'd never heard before. Dad's already talking about changing everything. Leaving it all to Nicole because she's the only one who truly cares about him. The bitterness in his voice was toxic. She's manipulated him completely, Danielle's voice added from off-camera. Playing the devoted daughter-in-law while turning him against his real family. The current version of Danielle let out a strangled sob as she watched her recorded self casually discuss their father's potential accident. Mark had gone completely pale, his hands gripping the chair arms so tightly his knuckles were white. But it was Justin's reaction that cut deepest. He stared at the screen in horror, finally seeing his family for what they truly were. "You knew," he whispered to his mother. "You all knew and you let me believe." "Let you believe what?" I asked softly. "That your father's fall was an accident? That finding him at the bottom of the stairs was just bad luck? That the timing of his death, just days before he planned to meet with his own lawyer, was coincidental?" The video continued, showing more conversations, more planning, more casual discussions of Andrew's mortality as if it were a business problem to be solved. Harold's face had gone ashen as he watched his recorded self coordinate the legal aspects of their scheme. "This could destroy my practice," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "It should," I replied without sympathy. "Andrew trusted you to protect his interests, and instead you helped them plan his financial elimination. And possibly worse." Samantha finally found her voice again, but it came out as a harsh whisper. We didn't." "Didn't what?" I asked. "Didn't push him down the stairs? Or didn't think he would actually fall when you removed the safety rails he'd asked Mark to install? When you forgot to refill his medication that helps with balance? When you encouraged him to use the stairs instead of the elevator you'd convinced him he didn't need?" The room felt smaller with each revelation. The family portraits on the walls seemed to be watching, judging, bearing witness to the complete destruction of the Morrison legacy. "He documented everything," I continued, letting the silence build between each word. "Every small cruelty, every calculated risk you put him in, every conversation you thought was private. Andrew may have been old, but he wasn't foolish. He knew exactly what you were capable of." Justin stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "I didn't know," he said desperately. "I swear to you, Nicole, I didn't know they were planning any of this. But the damage was done. Whether he had actively participated or simply chosen to remain willfully blind, the result was the same. His father was dead, and his family had orchestrated every aspect of that death, from the financial arrangements to the physical circumstances that made it possible." The video finally ended, leaving us in a silence so complete that the ticking of Andrew's antique clock sounded like thunder. For people who had entered this room as grieving family members now sat exposed as conspirators in an elderly man's death. And I was no longer the woman they had forced to walk behind them at the funeral. I was the woman who held all the evidence. The aftermath of the video left the room in a state of suspended chaos. Samantha was the first to recover, her survival instincts kicking in with the desperation of someone watching their entire world crumble. "That will is fake," she declared, her voice rising with manufactured indignation. "Andrew was completely out of his mind those last few months. Anyone could have coerced him into signing anything." Mark nodded frantically, grasping at the lifeline his mother had thrown. "The medication made him paranoid. He was seeing conspiracies everywhere. You took advantage of a sick old man." "We can contest this," Danielle added, her voice shrill with panic. "No court will honor a document signed by someone in his condition." I listened to their desperate protestations while walking slowly to Andrew's wingback chair, the same chair where he'd shared his plans with me during those quiet evening conversations they'd never bothered to interrupt. The leather still held the faint scent of his cologne, and as I settled into its familiar embrace, I felt his presence surrounding me like armor. "You're all absolutely right," I said calmly, reaching for the glass of water Harold had poured earlier. Andrew was definitely not in his right mind those last few months. Their faces brightened with premature hope, thinking I was about to validate their claims. He was angry, I continued, taking a small sip. Hurt. Disappointed in the family he'd worked his entire life to build. But his mind, sharp as ever. Harold shuffled through his papers with increasing agitation. Mrs. Morrison, these are very serious allegations. If there's any question about your father-in-law's mental capacity when he signed this document. There isn't, I interrupted gently. Because the will you're also concerned about? It's completely irrelevant. The confusion on their faces was almost comical. Justin leaned forward, his brow furrowed. What do you mean irrelevant? I reached into my purse and withdrew a thick manila folder, placing it on the coffee table with deliberate care. I mean that Andrew transferred all the major assets to me years ago. The house, the investments, the company shares. Everything you just heard Harold read out. None of it belonged to Andrew at the time of his death. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as the implications sank in. That's impossible, Samantha whispered. We would have known. There would have been paperwork, legal documents. There were, I said, opening the folder to reveal neat stacks of bank statements, transfer documents, and legal filings. Lots of them. All properly filed, all completely legitimate, all dating back several years. Harold reached for the folder with trembling hands, his professional training warring with personal dread. As he examined the documents, his face went through several color changes before settling on a sickly gray. These appear to be authentic, he managed. The transfers are dated, going back 5 years. 5 years, I repeated, letting the words sink in. Andrew started moving assets into my name the same week Samantha told him I was just a gold digger who married up. I pulled out a specific document showing them the date. This house transfer, completed the day after Mark borrowed $50,000 for his gambling debts and never said thank you. Danielle sank into the love seat, her face pale. But nobody told us. Nobody told you because nobody needed to tell you, I explained. You assumed Andrew would always be there to bail you out, fund your lifestyles, and clean up your messes. He let you assume that while quietly ensuring you could never hurt him, or me financially. Justin stood abruptly, knocking over a side table in his agitation. You manipulated him. You isolated him from his family and turned him against us. The accusation hung in the air like poison. After 23 years of marriage, after all the evidence of his family's cruelty, Justin was still ready to blame me rather than face the truth about the people he'd defended for so long. Did I asked, my voice deadly calm. Let me show you something. I reached for another section of the folder, withdrawing a chronological list that Andrew had helped me prepare months earlier. Every asset transfer is dated to correspond with a specific incident. Shall we review them together? I slid the list across to Justin, watching his face as he read. January 15, 2020. The day you started your affair with Rebecca. Andrew transferred the first block of company shares to my name that afternoon. Justin's face went white. How did he? March 3, 2021. The day Samantha told Andrew I was an embarrassment to the family name at the charity gala. He moved the investment portfolio the next morning. Samantha's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Should I continue? I asked. Because there are dozens of entries here. Every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every time you made it clear I wasn't really family. Andrew documented it all and responded accordingly. Mark grabbed the list, scanning it frantically. His name appeared repeatedly. Unpaid loans, broken promises, casual insults directed at me that he'd thought went unnoticed. June 12, 2022, I read aloud. The day Mark called me the help in front of the Patterson family at the country club. Andrew transferred the beach house deed that evening. I was joking, Mark protested weakly. Were you? I stood up, moving to Andrew's desk where another folder waited. Because Andrew kept a journal too. Would you like to hear what he wrote about that particular joke? The room felt smaller with each revelation. These people who had spent decades treating me like an outsider, who had forced me to walk behind them at Andrew's funeral, were discovering that their victim had been protected all along. The will Harold read today? I continued, returning to Andrew's chair. That was a test. A final opportunity for you to show even a shred of decency, to honor the man who had given you everything. You failed spectacularly. Harold was frantically examining transfer documents, his professional reputation crumbling with each authentic signature and notarization he verified. This is all legitimate, he muttered. Every document is properly executed and filed. So when you tried to steal my inheritance, I said, letting the words hang in the air, you were actually stealing nothing. The house you're sitting in? Mine for 3 years. The company shares you were counting on? Mine for 4 years. The investments? Mine for 2 years. The beautiful irony was not lost on any of us. They had committed fraud, conspiracy, and possibly worse, all to steal assets that no longer existed in Andrew's name. You stole nothing, I told them, my voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed anger and newfound power, because by the time Andrew passed, you were already left with air. Justin slumped back into his chair, the full scope of his family's downfall finally hitting him. But the business, our whole lives. Your whole lives were built on Andrew's generosity, I corrected. Generosity you mistook for weakness, kindness you repaid with cruelty. He spent 5 years quietly protecting himself and me from exactly this scenario. The Morrison family empire, built over generations, sustained by Andrew's hard work and business acumen, had vanished not through death or disaster, but through their own greed and blindness. They had destroyed themselves. The weight of their collective downfall hung heavy in the air when I slowly rose from Andrew's chair, smoothing my black dress with deliberate calm. 4 pairs of eyes tracked my movement, each face painted with a different shade of desperation. I made one call this morning, I announced, my voice cutting through their stunned silence. They'll be here any second. The reaction was immediate and beautiful in its chaos. Harold's briefcase tumbled from his lap, spilling papers across the Persian rug. Mark's face flushed crimson, his hands instinctively moving to loosen his tie as if he couldn't breathe. Danielle let out a sharp gasp that bordered on a shriek, her perfectly manicured fingers clutching at her throat. But it was Samantha's response that surprised me most. The woman who had commanded this household for decades simply closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. You called them before you even got here, Justin said, his voice hollow with realization. You knew exactly how this would play out. While you were all getting dressed for the reading, assuming you'd walk away wealthy and vindicated, I was on the phone with Detective Morrison, no relation, I said with a slight smile, explaining that I had evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and possibly something much worse. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through the tension like a blade. For a moment nobody moved. Then Mark shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I'm not going to prison for this, he declared wildly. This is all Mom's idea. Sit down, Samantha commanded, her voice regaining some of its old authority. And keep your mouth shut. But the damage was already spreading. Harold was frantically stuffing documents into his briefcase, his hands shaking so violently that papers scattered like autumn leaves. I need to call my attorney, he muttered. This consultation is over. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, more insistent. I'll get it, I said pleasantly, as if welcoming guests for afternoon tea. The 2 officers at the door were exactly what I'd hoped for. Professional, serious, and clearly prepared for a complex situation. Detective Morrison, a stern woman in her 40s, introduced herself and her partner while I led them into the den where 4 people sat frozen in various poses of guilt and terror. Mrs. Morrison? Detective Morrison asked, though she was looking directly at me. That's me, I confirmed. Thank you for coming so quickly. As the officers stepped fully into the room, I moved to the coffee table where 3 sealed envelopes waited. I'd prepared them that morning while the family was getting ready for what they'd assumed would be their moment of triumph. Before we discuss the fraud and conspiracy charges, I said, placing my hand on the envelopes, I have some personal items to return. The theater of it was deliberate. After decades of their carefully orchestrated humiliations, I allowed myself this one moment of dramatic justice. I picked up the first envelope, labeled Samantha, in my careful handwriting. This belongs to you, I said, sliding it across the table to my former mother-in-law. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a cheap costume jewelry necklace that sparkled with fake diamonds. The sticky note attached bore her own words. Didn't suit you anyway. You stole this from my jewelry box 3 years ago, I explained to the officers, who were watching with professional interest. During Thanksgiving dinner. You claimed it was too fancy for someone like me, then walked out wearing it. Samantha's face cycled through shame, rage, and humiliation. It was just a trinket, she whispered. Petty theft is still theft, Detective Morrison noted, making a note in her pad. The second envelope went to Mark, who stared at it as if it might explode. Open it, I encouraged. Inside was a document that looked official at first glance, until closer inspection revealed it was a template I'd downloaded and modified. Debt forgiveness letter void was stamped across the top in red ink. Mark owes me $537,000, I announced calmly. Various loans over the years that Andrew co-signed. Since I'm now Andrew's heir, those debts transfer to me. I smiled sweetly. This version is void. I expect full repayment within 30 days. Mark's face went from red to white to green in rapid succession. I don't have that kind of money, he choked out. Then you'll need to sell some assets, I replied. I hear the job market is competitive for people with fraud convictions, so you might want to get started quickly. The third envelope was for Danielle, who had pressed herself so far back into the love seat that she appeared to be trying to merge with the furniture. This one's my favorite, I said, extending the envelope toward her. She didn't move to take it, so I opened it myself and pulled out a stack of printed emails. The headers were clearly visible. Romantic exchanges between Danielle Morrison and Harold Brennan, time-stamped over the past 6 months. Apparently Harold wasn't just helping with legal matters, I announced to the room. He was also helping with personal ones. Harold made a sound somewhere between a groan and a whimper. His career wasn't just over. It was about to become a public scandal that would follow him for the rest of his life. Danielle began crying in earnest now, ugly sobs that shook her entire body. How did you get those? She managed between gasps. Andrew had security cameras throughout the house, I explained, including in Harold's office upstairs, where you two thought you were having private conversations about altering the will. I paused, letting that sink in. Among other activities. Detective Morrison was writing rapidly now, her professional demeanor sharpening with each revelation. Mrs. Morrison, you mentioned fraud and conspiracy charges? All documented, I confirmed, gesturing toward Harold's abandoned briefcase. The will they tried to present today is completely fabricated. They've been planning this for months, as you'll see in the video evidence and recorded conversations. The officers exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that this was going to be a much bigger case than they'd initially anticipated. Harold Brennan, Detective Morrison announced formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud. The transformation was immediate and total. Harold's face crumpled as the handcuffs clicked into place, his professional dignity dissolving completely. I never meant for it to go this far, he pleaded, looking desperately around the room for sympathy he would never find. You have the right to remain silent, the officer continued, but Harold was already talking, his words spilling out in a desperate rush of confession and blame-shifting. As they led him toward the door, he turned back one last time. Samantha, tell them it was your idea. Tell them I was just following instructions. But Samantha had found her steel again. She sat perfectly straight, her hands folded in her lap, and said nothing at all. The door closed behind Harold with a finality that seemed to echo through the house. The man who had held their family's legal affairs in his hands for 15 years was gone, leaving behind nothing but scandal and the wreckage of multiple destroyed lives. Who's next? Detective Morrison asked, turning back to the remaining family members. The domino effect had begun. The aftermath of Harold's arrest left a vacuum in the room that seemed to suck all the air from the space. Detective Morrison was coordinating with her partner about evidence collection while the remaining family members sat in various states of shock and disbelief. That's when Justin finally found his voice. Nicole. The word came out cracked, desperate. He stood slowly, his hands extended toward me like a man reaching for a lifeline. We can fix this. All of this. I know things got out of hand, but we're still married. We're still family. The irony was so thick I could taste it. After 23 years of watching him choose his blood family over me every single time, he was finally ready to choose me, when I was the only one left with anything to offer. Fix this. I repeated, my voice carrying a dangerous calm that made him take a step back. You want to fix humiliating me at your father's funeral? Fix watching your family plot against the man who raised you? Fix standing silent while they treated me like hired help for over 2 decades? His face cycled through several expressions: guilt, fear, calculation, before settling on something that might have been genuine remorse if I hadn't known him so well. I didn't know about the will, he pleaded. I swear to you I had no idea they were planning to change it. If I had known. You would have what? I interrupted, standing to face him directly. Stopped them? Defended me? Chosen your wife over your precious family for once in your pathetic life? The words hit him like physical blows. Behind him, Samantha made a small sound of protest, but even she seemed to understand that her influence over her son had evaporated along with the family fortune. You stood there, I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word, and watched them make me walk behind you at Andrew's funeral. Like a servant. Like someone who didn't belong. You promised me that morning that things would be different, and the first test of that promise, you failed spectacularly. Detective Morrison looked up from her notes, clearly uncomfortable with the domestic drama unfolding before her, but professional enough to let it play out while she documented everything. Justin's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his failures crashed over him. I was trying to keep the peace. Dad had just died and everyone was emotional. Everyone was emotional? My laugh came out sharp and bitter. Your father was dead, Justin. Dead. And your family's first instinct was to put me in my place. To remind me that despite 23 years of marriage, despite caring for Andrew when none of you could be bothered, I was still just an outsider who'd married up. I reached into my purse one final time, withdrawing an envelope that had been waiting for this exact moment. Unlike the others, this one was thick, official, bearing the letterhead of the city's most prestigious divorce attorney. Now you'll follow me, I said, sliding the papers across to him. Into court. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope, his face going white as he scanned the contents. Divorce papers? But when did you? These are dated last week. While you were planning your inheritance windfall, I was planning my freedom, I replied. Everything's already filed. You just need to sign where indicated. The transformation in the room's dynamics was swift and complete. Samantha, who had spent decades orchestrating family decisions from her position of power, now sat diminished and silent. Mark stared at his shoes, probably calculating how he was going to explain a $500,000 debt to his wife. Danielle continued crying softly, her social status crumbling as thoroughly as her family's finances. Detective Morrison cleared her throat. Mrs. Morrison, we'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. We have enough here to begin proceedings against the remaining family members for conspiracy to commit fraud. Of course, I said graciously. I'll bring all of Andrew's documentation. He was very thorough in his record-keeping. As the officers prepared to leave, I walked slowly to the head of the dining table, the same table where I'd been relegated to serving duties for every family gathering, the same table where I'd been told countless times that there wasn't room for my opinions in family discussions. I pulled out Andrew's chair and sat down. The symbolism was lost on no one. This chair had been Andrew's throne, the seat of family power for over 40 years. Samantha had never been allowed to sit in it, even after her husband's death. It represented authority, legacy, control, everything they had assumed would pass to Justin as the eldest son. Now it was mine. What are you doing? Samantha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Taking my place, I replied simply. The place Andrew always intended for me to have. From this position I could see the entire room differently. The family portraits that had seemed so intimidating when I was standing against the wall now looked down at me with what felt like approval. Andrew's spirit seemed to settle around my shoulders like a comfortable shawl. You can't just, Mark started to protest, but his words died when he met my eyes. I can, I said with quiet authority. This is my house now. My table. My family legacy to protect or destroy as I see fit. The police finished their preliminary work and prepared to leave, but Detective Morrison paused at the door. We'll be in touch about the investigation. Given the complexity of the case and the video evidence, I expect there will be additional charges. After they left, the silence in the room was profound. For people who had entered this house that morning as members of a powerful, wealthy family now sat as criminal defendants facing financial ruin and social disgrace. I was never behind you, I said finally. my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly spacious room. I was just waiting for the right moment to pass you all. Justin looked up from the divorce papers, his face etched with something that might have been understanding. He planned all of this, didn't he? That this was his design from the beginning. Andrew taught me that patience could be its own form of power, I confirmed. He showed me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait, watch, and let people reveal exactly who they are. Samantha stood abruptly, her designer composure finally cracking completely. This isn't over, she declared, but her voice lacked any real conviction. Yes, I said calmly, it is. As the sun began to set through the den windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rug, I remained in Andrew's chair, my chair now, watching the family that had tried to erase me slowly dissolve into individual fragments of their former selves. The woman they had forced to walk behind them at the funeral was gone. In her place sat the new matriarch of a dynasty they would never be part of again. If this story of ultimate justice had you cheering for Nicole, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when she calmly took Andrew's chair at the head of the table, claiming her rightful place as the new matriarch. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.